Hey everyone, Adam here. Welcome back to Musky Town's Tying with the Pros. On this episode, we are going to tie another iconic pattern in musky fly fishing, and that is the 747, an articulated Buford with 3 different sections. There's a lot of videos out there on how to tie this pattern, most of which are done with a hook shank hook platform. So, you have a stinger in the rear, usually a 40 millimeter or so shank in the middle, and then nice big long shank. This is 6/0 Kona big game carnivore in the front. Definitely nothing wrong with that. It's a great platform, tied hundreds of flies on it, and they work and they catch fish. But in making this video series as useful as possible, there's other ways that we can tie this pattern. So for the sake of this video tonight, we are going to do so on shanks, all shanks, and we'll end up actually split ringing our hooks to this shank platform. Every part of this fly is going to be tied on shank. In the rear, we'll have a 28 millimeter big game shank. In the middle, we'll have a 40 millimeter big game shank. And then in the front, we're actually going to be using a custom twisted shank with a little bit of extra length to drop that, to split ring that front hook to. So I'm going to mix it up just a little bit, but one of the things you're going to notice is that when we tie this pattern on shanks, to make sure that our rear loop is oriented the way we need it, I'm just going to go ahead and show you here. You'll notice that both of these are oriented the same way. And so picture a split ring that's going to go ahead and attach those vertically. So if I were to try to put this in my vise right now, we'd end up with a turned hook, which just isn't what we're going for here. So we'll actually end up going ahead and turning our vise like this, and we'll drop our shank in. Just adjust it a little bit. So from there, this is going to start like most of our patterns, which, we put a thread base down on our shank. I'm a little overkill, so I will end up putting hard as hull on here just to secure the shank and reinforce it a little bit. Again, not necessary if you don't want to do it, but you can. And I'm going to repeat a few things if you've been watching the series, but in case this is the first time you're joining us, when we do our thread base, I really like to make sure our thread is nice and spun so that we get these nice little ridges on our hardware, whether that's a hook or a shank. And the purpose for that is to make sure that when we're lashing our materials down, nothing slides. And again, when you're tying these, if you forget occasionally and your thread flattens or something like that, don't worry about it. Just keep tying. So now that we're there, take our hardest hole. Stuff dries nice and quickly, so just give it a little bit of all over. And one thing I like to do, I like to put a little bit of this where the wire was cut on the shanks. Not because you need to, but because I've found that it kind of covers some of the sharper parts of those shanks a little bit. Over time, I've noticed that I break my thread less when I do that. So there we are. We've got our thread base done. So if you've watched some of our previous videos, you'll have noticed that we use different bucktail types in this fly, in most flies. And the reason for that is because some of our bucktail that we use is really nice and fine. some of our bucktail is really hollow so that it flares like when we get to the head. And then some of our bucktail is in between. And I'll try to revisit that if it makes sense as we go through. But the first tie-in that we're going to be doing on this fly is going to be pretty fine bucktail. And before we jump in here, one of the things that we're going to talk about is how we build a profile. And this is a recurring theme through the series. And that's because it changes a little bit from a single to an articulated fly. And when we're tying a multi-shank fly, especially something where you're going, 3 different shanks, what I like to do is I like to start with our shortest tie-ins first. And then as we progress through the fly, we increase the lengths of those and we open up our reverse ties and we build up that profile. And then when we get about to the 2/3 to 3/4 mark on the front of the fly, we'll kind of start to step back down and build kind of that head and that baitfish teardrop profile that we all love so much. And then we'll actually carry on as we build our Buford head so we don't lose our taper and go through that way. But I didn't do our materials run through. On this fly, we're actually going to be using mostly standard strung schlappen. This is nice and sorted stuff. It's like 6 or 7 inches right there. I have a couple random gray barred feathers here. These are natural done, and I'll end up throwing those in. But usually when I tie this particular color combo, it's usually just pink and white, which pink and white's one of my favorites, especially if you're fishing in Wisconsin. So when we get this first tie-in, we're going to start with, I would say, right around a 1/4 pencil. I like to start really sparse just because it gives us a little bit of extra room where as we advance in the fly, we can always add more bulk. It's kind of hard to go the other way. So I typically will try to do almost as little hair as we can get away with in the rear of the fly. And when we're spinning our bucktail around the shank, again, this is, this step is in every single video in the series just because it's such a common technique. But we hold our bucktail clump nice and thin. We do 2 nice loose wraps. And then what we'll do is I'll just put a little bit of pressure over the top and then we'll pull, and that thread will that bucktail will distribute itself all the way around the shank. And you'll notice here that if you need to help it around a little bit, that's completely okay. Once we get our hair on the shank, we'll kind of we'll tease those butt ends back, and then we'll just capture a little bit of them, 1/3 to a 1/2 on each wrap. If you did half, do half again on how many of those hairs are left. And then usually in 3 or 4 wraps around, you'll have all the butt ends captured, and you're really just locking in that tail of the fly. And again, if you're somebody who, when you tie, likes to just pound out as many flies as you can, and there's nothing wrong with that, then you don't need to do all kind of the bulletproofing pieces that we're doing here. If you're somebody that'll sit there and enjoy tying after work, and you want to, try to make this fly as durable as you can, definitely do that. And I'm just cleaning up these butt ends here again. This is just for me. So after we get our first tie-in of bucktail, we're actually going to go ahead and get our feathers. And you'll notice on strung schlappen, and if you're pulling schlappen out of a saddle, you get this kind of secondary feather at the base. I'm just going to pull that out. You'd rather do it before you start tying in than notice that you didn't do it. Because if you tie in and then later try to remove that, you'll actually, it makes it easy to pull the feather out. You don't want that. One of the things you'll notice with this strung schlappen is that where they pierce the stem of the feather to string it, often the stem will be a little bit more fragile right there. So I'll usually kind of strip to that point where it's still nice and flat on the shank. Then I'll tie in just above where it was pierced, just to make it so that we don't have extra concerns about this feather stem breaking. You'll notice that the vise is kind of in the way. And if you can see this on the video, it's kind of trying to flex on the stem. So what I'll do is I'll put thread cement on and turn this all so that everything has a chance to dry nice and aligned. And when I know everything is oriented the way I want it, then we'll go ahead and move on. So after we tie those stems in, we just take our scissors and cut nice and flush to the end of the stem, but you're not trying to cut down into your thread. So be careful of that. So you'll notice that the vise tried to move my stem a little bit from where I wanted it. But we're already right away working on that kind of teardrop profile as we move. I'm just turning my vise here for while we let this head cement. Lock our feathers in here for a sec. And especially on this first tie-in with these tail feathers, do not be afraid to put plenty on there. Again, you don't need to, like if you're locking these in, especially, if you're not stripping the stems out when you're tying them in, it's kind of just one of those feel good things. And again, when you have a fly that's been working, the goal is to make it work as long as possible. So if you have the time and you're able, you may want to use head cement there, super glue. You may not want to, all that's okay. So once you feel like that's had a chance to dry, we'll go ahead and turn our vise back again. So our next step after our tail tie-in and our feathers is our flash. And if you didn't see this from an earlier video, a nice little trick you can do to make your flash easier to work with. And in this video, we're using lateral scale 1/69 inch. So you cut a nice little slit right in the top of the plastic. And then when you need some flash, just go ahead and poke your scissors in there. And my preference for flash here, you don't need tons. I mean, if you're somebody who likes to use a lot of flash in your flies, like, of course, do what you want to do. But, when I'm tying, this is going to be, it's a natural pattern. So, I perceive that if we're using white and pink here, that we're looking for a little extra visibility. So I'm not opposed to using a little more flash than maybe I might otherwise, maybe in a sucker pattern that I knew we were going to fish in clear conditions. But what I'll do is you go ahead here and kind of measure out where the end of your feathers are. And then I know that I want my flash to go around 1/4 inch past that. So mark that midway point. Wrap it around our thread. And you just take your nail, tip of your thumb. Let's kind of distribute that flash over the top of the pattern. Again, from an earlier video, if this is your shank, the flash starts nice and like a line. And when you take your thumb and mush it down, you're spreading it over the cross, or spreading it over the top half of the fly. I have room to do 2 tie-ins, and I'd like to do a couple sets of feathers. The purpose of getting these all on this rear shank, it's going to end up being the same amount of bucktail, but I'd like to go hair, feathers. So on this next tie-in, we're going to go slightly denser, so just a little bit more than 1/4 pencil. I've got a little bit more hollow butts in the base of this tail. I just switched from my tail that had really, really fine hair and no hollow in the butts to a tail that's got just a little bit more hollow, which just means it's going to flare a little bit more. And what that means is if I was, for instance, using the same tail here and I wanted to build profile. You know, if I tried to cinch and tie this in regular, it isn't going to flare. So I might do a reverse tie with a tail like that. But right here, we'll end up just doing 2 nice loose wraps again. And as we tighten everything, it flares and spins. I just need to lock my vise down because I didn't. I've got nice even coverage all the way around. My feather stems are catching a little bit of that hair. There we go. And just like before, we sweep those butt ends back. Capture them. So whereas on the last section, on the first feathers we tied in, we actually tied those in. If this is the shank, we tied them in flat to the side. But if this was the shank, we tied the feather in. What's the easiest way to give this as an example? If this was our shank, we tied that first set of feathers in right on the side like this. But on this next section, we're actually going to end up going across. So if there's a curve to our feather, we actually will tie in so that that curve goes back into the middle in line with the shape that we're after. So you'll notice that I have a curve in the feather like this. I'm going to tie it in across the shank up here so that it comes in, and that's called tenting our feathers. And again, a lot of this is going to be a review if you've been watching the series so far, but for those of you who are joining us, want to make sure we don't miss anything. And depending on the curve of the feather that you have, it is possible to tent too far across the shank, whether that's a hook or a shank. If you try to tent too far across the shank with a feather that doesn't have enough curve, you might have a feather that just kind of sticks out a little bit more. So if you are tenting with a feather that just has a little bit of curve, you just do a little bit of tent, which just means tie that stem in, maybe like this rather than like this. And something I've been doing actually since one of these videos, since the video we did with Justin Hokanson on his war pig, and he talked about how he likes to kind of fold his stems back and give them an extra wrap or two before tying everything back in. And his rationale is that it would help lock the feathers so nothing pulled in or pulled out, pardon me. And what I found is it's such an easy fix or easy thing to do that it's kind of like, why not? I've just been, you fold that tag end of that feather, you give it 2 or 3 wraps and then snip it. And it's like, if it gives you any more durability, great. It doesn't take long enough really to discourage it. So now for our first reverse tie-in here, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll take the same thing we've been doing, but this time you'll notice that the tips of our feathers point towards the front of or tips of our hair points toward the front of the fly. And we do the same thing. We just kind of line it up there. 2 nice loose wraps. Then I like to put just a little bit of pressure on those as we pull around, and you'll notice your hair spin. So after we spin our hair, get nice even coverage around the shank again. We can either use our fingers or a tool. If you use your fingers, just take like 3 nice fingers and you push your hair back and you get control of it. You'll notice that as we increase the size of our thread dam, we reduce the flare that that hair has. And this first one will be pretty narrow. Just keep it all in line. Just picture we're going to grow that taper as we move forward in the fly. And I like to have each set of feathers just a little bit shorter than the set before it. If you want them all the same length, so that makes you happy, go for it. So when you go to tie these feathers in, we're tenting just a little bit more than we were on the previous feather tie-in. I want these a little bit more on the side though than on the top of the fly. So what that means is I just have to be a little more careful to make sure that my tent aims down and across a little bit. And when I get it where I want, you'll know. So again, once I'm tied in like that, I didn't have much tip on these feathers just since I had them, but we'll go ahead and we'll actually just tie those tips of those feathers backward a little bit. And there's not even enough there that I feel the need to cut those. And we'll go ahead and hand whip before we move on to our next section. And on this one, when we put our cement on, we're not just putting the cement where the feathers are, just because we want to go ahead and protect the thread head on the shank. And that just gets us a little bit more durability. So when we add our shank here, if you'll notice, there is a slightly bigger loop on this side than there is on this side. I like to have the slightly bigger loop towards the rear, and if we're splitting hairs, I like to have the other part of the shank facing down as opposed to up. That just means the part of the shank that folds down is on the underside. So yeah, that's our rear shank. One of the nice things about tying on shanks is you don't have to worry about sticking yourself when you're playing with the shape of the fly. And you'll notice, you know, if this was something that you had just tied as a single and you wanted to go fish this, you probably could, and it would fish. You'd of course need to add a hook, but as we build profile towards the front of the fly, we'll just go ahead and extend that shape. And this vise has a materials clip. And even then, I still like to use just a little 1-inch hair clip. So we had 3 tie-ins on our tail section. I'll go a little thicker, and I'll probably end up doing 4 tie-ins here. Sometimes if I grab more material than I intended, I'll end up doing 3 tie-ins again, you know, making it so that we still have room to increase density as we move forward. If we find ourselves, for instance, using too much material in the rear of the fly, it'll end up acting like a parachute and it won't swim the way we want it to. You'll notice that we're adding flash every 3 bucktail tie-ins. Seems like the sweet spot. There are times where, I'll mix it up and I'll use more or less flash. Like if I'm tying a fly for really clear conditions, I might use something that has just a touch of flash to it. But if I'm tying something that, for variation in my box where I want a little bit of increased visibility, for cloudy conditions or windy or you name it, there are times where, I'll tie a fly where I do, and this more applies to singles, but I'll tie flash in between each bucktail tie. But usually it's every 3 or so. And as we build our thread dam, you'll notice we're going up and down, up and down. If you try to tie in the same spot, your thread will roll down on top. I always like to take a little bit of extra time on the first tie-in onto a new shank. Reason being is it sets the tone, if you will, for the taper on the entire shank, since we're using it as our benchmark for future tie-ins. You'll notice that our tie-in on the underside is still a little more flared than we like. So all we have to do there when that happens, and if you don't have a rotary vise, that's fine. You'll get an eye for it, but you will do kind of a corrective wrap where you're really focused on the thread building up the dam on that part of the fly that needs to go down. And sometimes it's under, sometimes it's on the side. You do have a rotary vise, that's a great spot for them. You can just kind of go around, build up the dam on the spots that need to be fixed or need a little bit different angle, whatever you're trying to do. And then we advance our thread. And as a point of reference, if our first tie-ins were about a 1/4 pencil thickness, by the time we get to the front of the second shank, we're going to want to be right around 1/2 to 3/4 of a pencil. And I would probably err towards just over 1/2, because you can always increase bulk in the head. So when we add our flash after these 3 clumps we just tied in, we went bucktail, feathers, flash, bucktail, bucktail. There were feathers in there too, but then bucktail on the 3rd clump, we're going to do flash again. I only like to do 5 or 6 strands in the middle part of the fly. It's just enough to be seen and keep it flashy. It's not so much though that you're creating unnatural amounts of flash. And so I measure and I cut once I get the length I want. And same thing as before, do a couple moderately tight wraps to keep our flash from slipping out while we're adjusting its location. When you get a nice good distribution over the shank, I'll just take the kind of individual, and I see that the bases of the flash are mostly where I want them. And I'll just take my bodkin and make sure that that is as even as it looks like it is. Once I've confirmed, kind of hold it down and just give it a few extra wraps over the top there. And you'll notice sometimes that when you're tying on shanks like this, you'll have a tie-in that ends up being right near the edge of the shank. And that's no big deal. Just be careful when you're building up your thread dam there that you don't immediately try to like cinch down that thread dam, because if you really crank on your thread, especially before you've started to cover the end of that shank, you definitely increase the likelihood that you are going to cut your thread and break it. Again, taking an extra moment just near the edge of the shank to make sure that our thread dam ends up being concentric, and it will take concentric, and it will take a little bit of extra attention just to make sure. You notice that's standing up a little bit more than we want still, so all we have to do is go back and give it a little bit more. All right, so when that taper is where we want it, I very much feel like that's the case here. Just advance our thread a little bit further forward. We're thinking about, okay, we got 2 more tie-ins here. What are they going to look like? Where are they going to go? Just kind of helps you keep your spacing even. I haven't done this yet, but I like to measure each time, because even as you increase length, even if you're working your way down the tail and getting a little bit longer and a little bit longer, there are times where you won't be increasing or decreasing length but as much as you intended. And if your hair is a little long, you want to trim it. If your hair is a little short, which happens sometimes too, if you're cranking a bunch of flies out, like your taper over time, if you're focused on it, will build out, and it's not the end of the world. And what I'll often do, if necessary, especially when I'm production tying, is if I cut a clump of bucktail out and it's not long enough, I will put it in my stacker and then save it for later. And usually I just kind of keep in mind, oh, I've got that clump over there. And just a little bit to this thread dam. We're pretty close on the taper here. And you really will get a feel, especially as you time more and more of these, about, when you first start, you might do a little bit of thread dam, see where you're at, a little bit of thread dam, see where you're at. You will get to a point though where you just know you're cranking away, how long it's going to be, and then, hey, you look and your taper is pretty close. Maybe it needs a little bit of minor adjustment, or maybe it doesn't. So really happy with the way this taper is coming together. We'll just keep working our way there. And just a quick thank you to everyone. While we've been going through these videos, the feedback you're all sending in, whether that's phone calls or whether that's comments on the videos or messages through Insta or Facebook, really please keep them coming. This has been great. It's been a blast making all these, and hearing that everyone's enjoying them so much has been a treat. And if you heard that beep right there, my wife just updated our list of baby names that we're considering. definitely going to have to look at that when we're done here. And no, we're not asking for name suggestions. And if you're someone who doesn't want to use a stacker to line your ends up, definitely not necessary. That's a personal thing that just, it's a little bit tidier in my mind for while I tie these. Actually, I'll go just a little further forward. At least attempt to. So this is actually good to see. Every once in a while, you know, when you go to crank a little bit of extra thread tension in, or yeah, like I got a little heavy handed with my first couple wraps and my bucktail didn't spin. That will happen every once in a while. And when it does happen, that's okay. All you got to do, you loosen your wraps a little bit, take your pressure off, and you'll notice your hair kind of relax there if you pull or not. And then when you go and pull again, your hair will correct itself. So I got that nice even coverage. It just took relaxing the thread a little bit. So once that's where we want it, and it is, we push it back. I'm really happy with this profile so far, and we are going to go ahead and we'll get a picture of this at the end here. You'll notice I'm using the same bucktail most of the way up. I used that fine no hollow in the butt's tail in the very first tie-in. And then I switched to the one that had some nice hollow in the bases, and almost until we get to the head tie-in, that'll be the same tail that we use. It's going to respond well when, you know, we're trying to make it flare a certain amount with our thread dam. Up until we get to the head, and I have a different tail set aside just for that. Reason being, I want really hollow hair, and we're going to end up using some pink too when we get up there. You know, what I'm doing right now is when you're holding the hair back and you do your thread dam, sometimes that hollow butt section that's helping it stand up will be a little bit extra compressed. So you may think that your thread dam is where you want it, but if you say, for instance, you were tying a fly overnight and you got to the end, it got late, you wanted to go to sleep, you left it in the vise, and you came back the next day, you might notice that that tie-in was more flared. So what I'm doing, I'm just kind of teasing out the ends like this, just trying to get an idea of where I feel like that thread dam really is, instead of just where it was because I was holding the hair down. So we're happy with that. Time for another flash tie-in. Again, just like 5 or 6 threads, strands. If any of the techniques that we've gone through you're looking for more information on, definitely feel free to check out our previous Buford video. A lot of the techniques are shared. The biggest difference in that one is how we build our profile. With a single, we start longer and we work our way shorter in the belly. With these articulated flies, especially the bigger multi-shanked articulated flies, we'll start shorter, increase longer, and then go back shorter again. But, you know, a lot of the specific techniques around hollow tying, you know, if you're just starting to learn to hollow tie, you probably do want to start with, you know, a river pig or a Buford or something a little bit more on the straightforward side. I refrain from calling it simple because you can go as complex as you'd like while tying even a relatively straightforward pattern. And again, you get your flash where you want it. We'll move forward and we'll go ahead and hand whip here. If you wanted to do kind of a second set of pectoral fins here, you could. You know, let's go ahead and do that. Why not? And what I'll do when I'm doing multiple shanks like this is, you know, I'll make sure that this set curves back, and then I actually on the front, and this is a silly technique, I'll actually flare the feathers out. Because we're gonna need it again. Same thing as before, just strip out that little under feather, this little guy. And the feathers I pulled are a little longer than I intended. I will usually go a little bit shorter than the last tie in a bucktail there. And one of the techniques from tenting our feathers before, take the flat part of our scissors. Right now, if I tried to tent this, it might want to roll on the shank. So we actually go and hold the feather in sideways and flatten the stem for tying across. And I used to do this with tweezers, then needle nose pliers, and I found that this flat part on these scissors really is just the best that I've found. The grizzly on these really does add a nice element of complexity, especially, I mean, picture a fish and this thing's ripping through the water. Like, it's not looking this necessarily as like, oh, that's got black and white bars. It's just, you know, who knows if a fish looks at that and says, oh, that looks more complex, or I'd love to tell you exactly what a muskie is thinking. It's probably just swearing at anything at any time. Usually just when we want them to eat. It's like, boop. So now, you see what we're doing here so far. And if you don't want to go crazy with your thread base for a shank like this, you do not have to be this careful. Part of why I am doing this is just consistency, and it makes me feel good about it. But especially when we go to the front part of this shank here in just a second, my goal is for when we start to tie the head on, my goal is to make it so that it's as close to a single round or flat shank as we can get, more like spinning a Buford head on a regular hook. Actually, I was going to do one more whip finish, but I realized that I don't want to build extra thread there because that's where we're going to be spinning our head around. So given the length of this shank, we'll probably end up doing 3 or 4 tie-ins. Let me just think, 1, 2, 1, 2. Probably end up doing 4 tie-ins before we get to the head here. Alternatively, if you wanted, you could do 3 thicker ones. Tie in on the first shank, we were right around a 1/4 pencil thickness. By the last tie in on the first shank, we were right around a 1/2 pencil thickness. And then as we moved to the next shank in the middle, the second shank was started right around maybe a 1/2 pencil thickness plus. By the front of that shank, we got to call it maybe a little bit less than 2/3 of pencil thickness. And then on this first tie-in for the last shank here, this will be our longest tie-in, but in terms of thickness, it really is right around 2/3 or so a pencil thickness, and plus or minus, like this is all relative, but if you're someone who's going to be throwing this on a 12 weight, you're going to be less concerned about the amount of material than if you're going to be, fishing this on a 10 weight. And you will get a sense for how thick you want these to be when you're tying them. So we're still a little bit longer here, hair length wise, than we were for the last one. This will be our longest tie-in on the fly. We'll start to taper back down after it. Same thing as before. We start to pull, but before I really cinch this down, this loop wants to stop my hair from spinning around. Just take your bodkin through there and help it. And you'll notice hair's pretty hollow in the bases. It wanted to flare, and that's completely fine. It's going to hold that profile well when we put our thread dam on. And just like before, we take our 3 fingers, shank in the middle, push our hair back and get control of it. Just use our fingers. We just want to make sure that the tie-in's not an oval at an angle like this. You want that nice and square to your shank. And that's just going to make it so that when we do our thread dam, that we get this nice even taper all the way around. And there will be times where, often where you're going to have to do corrective wraps to get your profile lined up the way you want, if you care enough to. If you don't, you can go fish it. If it swims well, just fish it and enjoy it. But if you do care enough to go ahead and fix it, you will get a little bit more consistent shape and taper to your profile if you take that extra step. Just like before, you kind of tease with it, make sure it's going to go where you want when you call it good. And you'll notice we'll want to give it just a little bit more thread dam on the bottom there to bring that in, but our shape's really nice and consistent and round. It makes me happy. It's pictured Bob Ross painting a happy little tree next to the river. So I'm pretty happy with that. You can see the shape coming together, and if you want, we'll take the clip out and you can just see that extends, from the short bucktail tie-ins to the tips of our feathers, all the way up and forward. And then now we're going to focus on starting to come back down. So again, just like before, we're going to measure, because I want to make sure that this is now getting a little bit shorter than the tie-in before it. One of the benefits of tying on shanks as opposed to hooks like this is hooks, even though you can resharpen them if you ding them off a rock or, dull them some other way, you eventually, a hook has a limited amount that it can be sharpened. And what's great about tying like this is that, especially if you're making your own shanks, you can really play with shank length and do some different things. But if you're not, and you're just, it gives you the ability to split ring hooks in indefinitely. And if you have a hot fly that works fall after fall, and you're not the sentimental type that wants to retire them, and nothing wrong with that if you are. I got a little collection back there. You can definitely do that and increase the life of a fly. So again, really happy with our taper right here. I'm going to do one more tie-in before we do our flash. So as we work our way forward, we're going to go ahead and keep shortening down now as we move toward the head. But I wanted to point out, and I think I just skimmed over this since we'd covered this in some past videos, but when you cut the hair from the hide, it's got these little under hairs in it. Let's go ahead and hold those and brush those out and flick those out. And you just want to make sure that none of those are in there. You just get a better bond to the hook shank. And when you get close to this middle shank, if you're using this type of shank, real quick, if you're not someone that's twisting your own shanks, you're welcome to use, to go 28, 40, 40 or millimeter shanks, or if you want to go, 28, 45, 55, like whatever shank mix you have, that's fine. If you are somebody who isn't going to be doing like a drop loop and a custom built shank, you can put split rings between your shanks, and you can just go ahead and drop your stinger off of that. Or, if you're so inclined, a treble, and that trebles are a little bit, that's a topic for another day, but you do have some different options there. And just like we have been, we do our nice 2 loose wraps. We're definitely going to need to help the hair around with the shank in the way this time. Because if we don't, it's not going to want to come around. Just we're too close to the loop for it too. But if we are a little more intentional and we do help that hair all the way around, everything will spin just the way we want it to. Just takes an extra sec. Now that we've got our nice even coverage, spin this around a little bit again. And similar to before, we're getting a little close to the end of the shank where it was cut and folds over. So just proceed cautiously. It is a bit of a pain if you break your thread here. It will happen, so don't sweat it if you do. But go a little slow to start, you decrease the likelihood of that happening. So we just did 3 more tie-ins and we're ready for another little bit of flash here. Again, another 5-6 strands, kind of in line with what we've been doing. And just like before, we distribute our flash across the top. And you do not need to do this with a bodkin. Like if you want to use the tip of your scissors or something to make sure that the flash is laying the way you want it to, great. If you don't have to. Once you get it where you want it, give a few wraps over the top of that. And now that we're on the other side of the loop in our shank, or we're getting close, we'll have probably 1-2 more tie-ins before we get to our head. I will go ahead and do our pectoral feathers. And the way we do our pectoral feathers is definitely a personal thing. I want to do these ones in reverse to have them flare a little bit, like picture looking at the feather, and we'll actually make it so that the curve faces forward. Again, take our curve and it's going to face out. And this is just in line. This, if this was more of a glide fly or something like that, I might curve the feathers inward, just because of how I picture it swimming. But again, this is pure personal preference, how you choose to, or if you choose to do pectoral fins on your flies. This is a spot where I'll definitely, in the interest of durability and having those last, and by the way, if you lose a pectoral fin over time, say you catch a pike and it falls out sooner, or even a muskie, I've noticed that flies that have like one eye that where they started to, or a single pectoral fin, or like kind of the funky stuff, those are the ones that often get eaten a lot. I mean, they get eaten with everything too, but I've definitely had, I feel like I've noticed almost even more success. Like once it gets the slime on it, like fish are going to eat it. So at this point, you really can be using closer to pencil thickness worth of hair. And I'll be using even more than that when we do the head. But we're still slightly shortening our hair length now in relation to our previous tie-in. And I think this is exactly the length that we want here. And especially as you get more and more hair, this is a time where you're going to want to take some extra focus on making sure that your hair is evenly spun around the hook shank or the shank. Reason being, if you have more hair on one side, you're going to have to do quite a few more corrective wraps with as much hair as starts to become the case at this point in the fly. Everything's pretty even around the shank. I'll move forward here. So now that we have our taper again where we want it in our thread dam, we're going to go ahead, we'll advance our thread. We're about ready to do the head here. Lean towards wanting to do one more tie-in before we do the head. Reason being, I don't like my heads on Bufords to be ultra dense. I really do err almost towards a bulkhead. And the only difference between a bulkhead and a Buford, or any other fly with a spun deer hair head, is the amount of tie-ins. So I'm switching tails now as we move forward in the fly. I'd like to do just a little bit of a color blend into the pink. We'll use a darker pink most likely, or even like kind of the pinkish brown base back of the bucktail for the head itself. But for, let's call it this neck tie-in, our length really is right around, it's in line with what we want for getting slightly shorter from the previous tie-ins. And again, making sure our hair spins nice and evenly around. I did have to use my fingers there to help it just with the shape of the shank here near the end. There's quite a bit of hair on this fly too. And especially for this last tie-in before our head, because we're not going to have a ton of space for our head. I'm pretty okay with having a little bit of extra flair in this tie-in, because we want to make sure that the shoulders in our taper don't just go steeply down to a head. I mean, you can if that's your tying style and you want to, but I really like to make it so that the shoulders of a Buford or a 747 or Hillbilly Deluxe, or any one of the flies that goes down to a small head, not the Hillbilly Deluxe, the 747 or Buford, pardon me, that the taper still makes sense. Like we've taken all this time to build this nice shape to this fly. When we do get to the head, there's nothing that in my mind kills a vibe. Spending all this time to tie an incredible fly and then just going down to deer hair at the end and having this head that just isn't in line with the rest of what you've done. Some people don't care, and that's cool. If you don't care, then tie it and fish it and be happy with it. But if you do, there are a few things that we can do to help keep consistency of taper before we get to the head. So we don't have a ton of space left here. You can see we're getting close to the eye. We do have enough space, however, for our head. And all we do is make sure you have a little bit of a thread base there. You'll notice when I do a head, I will pull hair from either, down in the front here where it's really hollow and snappy. The other place is on the rear. There's also a bunch of really hollow hair that works well in this capacity. So when we pull out our next clump, and this is going to be our first clump for the head tie-in, we're doing so with a couple things in mind. One is we want to make sure that the taper is continued into the head. We want something that's a little bit shorter than our last bucktail tie-in. But then we also want to make sure that the butt ends that we have flare in the head, which is going to be our first head tie-in. We want to make sure that they are long enough so that we don't have a bare spot in the shoulders before the second head tie-in. And again, this is kind of very theory level. Like if you are ripping through Buford heads and you're like, I'm really happy with my Bufords, I don't really care if, the taper's perfect into the head and they fish great for me, then like, great, do that. But if you're trying to focus on improving your technique as a tyer and on getting as much out of the flies that you tie as you can, then I do recommend taking the time to understand how you're trying to, okay, so this is our last tie-in. We want, our hair to be about there. We don't want it to just be short and then all of a sudden we just got our head. Like that's what happens sometimes if you're using like deer hair for your head, which if that's your thing, okay, but it's not mine. Right now I've got maybe pencil and a half, and I actually want a little bit more than that. So I'm going to take a little more hair. And I'm kind of around that edge where like I'm near the base of the tail and almost going to the rear. So I even have like a few brown hairs hollow, or a few brown hairs mixed in, but they're all really hollow. So that's completely okay. And that hollow is what's going to help your hair spin and flare the way that you want when you make your head. So a solid amount of hair right here. Let's say 2+ pencils thickness worth. And I'm still going to take the extra time to get all the under hairs and short hairs out of it. If you're doing this at the dining room table, and there's somebody else in the house who might not be real thrilled about that, not a bad idea to have a garbage bag hanging off the stem of your vise. Just kind of wrap it around if you're using a pedestal. Loose hair, or if you're like me, just have hundreds of little pink hairs all over your lap. So now we know that we want about, let's call it a little more than 3/4 of an inch sticking out on the butt ends here. I got hair that's in the way of my thread, so I'm just going to get it out of there. We're just going to go two nice loose wraps. And then we just kind of do that same little bit of pressure as we pull everything tight. And you may need to help it around the shank. That's completely okay if you do. I find myself needing to help hair around a shank much more than I need to help it around a hook. If you wanted to be done right here and just tie this, certainly okay. You'd be kind of more bulkhead 747-ish, and there's nothing wrong with that. I wanted to do a two-tone head on this one, so we're going to do a two-tone head on this one. So on this last tie-in, I'm just doing an accent. We don't really need a lot of hair, half a pencil to a pencil, if that. If you had, on the 2.5 pencil range here, you may want to go a little bit less. If you had less, you may want to go a little bit more, but you're kind of tying this hair right on top of the hair that was there before. You probably don't want to go thicker with this clump than you did with your previous clump, just because the neck would be a little funky. And really, this is an accent color. I mean, if you really wanted to tie this off and dam off the head, you could now. But one of the things that you're going to notice is usually what I would do is if the hook eye was right here between us, I would put the hair on this side of it. I would do a couple wraps diagonal, and if I was tying on a hook, the eye of the hook would hold that thread from slipping off the front. But where we are right now, we're tying on a shank, so we don't quite have that same edge that's going to capture our thread when we wrap it around, which is fine. It just requires a little bit different technique. So rather than what I just described, what we'll do is I will hold this hair back and out of the way. And then when it's out of the way, I will just put this clump into my fingers. And the goal here is make sure that as I'm doing these loose wraps, that we are not just capturing a whole bunch of existing hairs from that previous tie-in. And that's the reason why we're even doing this, because if I try to do that traditional technique, I would. There's just not enough space otherwise. There's not enough space otherwise. So we did our 2 loose wraps. We know we're on the shank. This is a unique situation. And what we'll do is I will actually hold my thumb here so that it doesn't slip off. And as I pull, I'm going to help this spin. And I'm keeping my thumb and my fingers pinched. And you'll notice that that hair will work its way all the way around. And I'm actually watching the brown tips to know that they went all the way around, because that's the same, you know, you're going to know that the hair in front of those also went all the way around. And we're just going to, once we get it spun all the way and there's good coverage and it looks like it's nice and consistent, we're almost done. We still have to do our lock wraps. And what that means is just kind of, you shake the same way we did it before. We kind of shake our thread a little bit because we're trying not to wrap the hairs around and separate the head. We're just trying to get our thread through there. And I'm going to do 3 more wraps. And when I get through, we're very close to done. I actually will use my tool for this. You can use a pen, you can use your fingers, like you don't have to do this, but I like the way that this tool makes a nice even head. Like it doesn't trap hairs that are going to be diagonal. And I just noticed I did capture a hair, which happens sometimes. And if you do, just pick it out, you'll be fine. So now we've got our tie-in, everything's locked in. We're mostly just finishing now. Again, you'll notice that if somebody's tying with deer hair, bass bugs, for instance, there's a lot of videos out there, but some folks will actually use their bodkin and they will poke and kind of part the hair and pull their thread through. I think that's a little overkill, but when you're pulling your thread forward, just kind of navigate it so that you're not trapping hairs. It is easy to do. And if you do it, it's not the end of the world, but you'll be a little happier if you take that moment to just be careful. And so this fly is very close. I'm happy with it. We'll trim it all in just a second, but I'm gonna tie back just a little bit more first. So now that our head is mostly done, if you're someone who really wants to take extra time and do a thread dam to hold your hair back, you can. You don't really need to. I tend to tie this back enough that the head's mostly standing up the way that I want it. And then from there, I will just go ahead and hand whip. And you're definitely going to want to be a little cautious doing this, because especially when you run out of room like this, the tendency is going to be for your hair to want to get trapped. And if you are cautious about that, you can kind of keep it from doing that. So like you'll notice right there, one hair tried. I'm using the pressure of my thumb against the hair stack to keep it from really, to keep that hair back out of the way of the whip finish loop as it closes. Got our whip finish. Really, this fly's done pre-trimming. I'm going to do one more whip finish just because it makes me feel good. So once we whip, we can go ahead and cut. And this is a spot where just we've spent all this time on this fly. I will almost always use some head cement on the thread. Try not to get too much of this on the hair, especially if you're using like super glue, because you can weaken the hair. But I mean, that's our profile. That's our untrimmed fly. And I'll do another coat there in a sec, but just do a real quick rough trim. And what I do is I'll put my arm on my armrest if you have one. And I have a rotary where I know that my hook eye is mostly in the same spot here. It's not doing too much. And I will just rotate the rotary around and trim and just try to get everything nice and rough, trimmed, and even. And really, like, if you do this, like to do this rough, then do it rough and call it good. And that's completely okay. If you're somebody that likes to really kind of get it as good as you can get it, and you want it, you feel good about it when it's pretty neat looking. I think a Buford and a 747 are kind of one of those places where the deer hair head personal preference shines through a lot. So after we do our first rough trim, and I mean, you see it's most of the way there. You're definitely good there. I knew that when we were getting to the end of the head that some of that hair wasn't going to spin around all the way, and that's completely okay. If that happens, all you do is just kind of come in here and even things out a little bit. And your goal here is just to have a nice even amount of hair all the way around the head, so that you get a kind of erratic, unpredictable swim. You do want left, right, but you also want up and down. Fun thing you can do here if you want is you can pinch the hair with eyes. You can cut out spots and glue eyes in. Again, another personal preference spot. So yeah, there it is. 747 on shanks. If you have any questions, if there's anything else you want to know, let us know. Thank you all for all the incredible feedback on the series so far. It has been a blast making these. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Musky Town's Tying with the Pros.